Jesse Weber stood at the center of the screen, welcoming viewers to Law and Crime's continued live coverage of the federal trial of Sean Diddy Combs in New York. The moment had arrived at verdict watch was officially underway. The jury had just been sent back to deliberate after receiving a long and detailed reading of the final jury instructions. Those instructions, Weber explained, were crucial. They would serve as the law the jurors must apply in their decision-making. For the next 2 hours, Jesse announced, the panel would be taking audience questions while they awaited any news. He noted that it was probably unlikely they'd get a verdict today though, as he said with a smile, stranger things had happened. Weber recapped that Judge Arun Subramanian had carefully read through the elements of all charges, from racketeering, conspiracy to sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, as well as transportation for prostitution. He pointed out that racketeering conspiracy was arguably the most complex charge. The government had to prove a mutual agreement to commit criminal activity, even if it wasn't formally stated. Actions speak louder than words. The judge had reminded the jury, you wouldn't see signed contracts among conspirators, but inference, based on behavior, was enough. Weber highlighted the 8 predicate crimes central to the government's case: bribery, arson, forced labor, kidnapping, drug offenses, among others. He emphasized that only 2 of them, within a 10-year window, needed to be proven for a RICO conviction. He also noted the judge's important instructions about immunity. Jurors were to scrutinize testimony from witnesses granted immunity more carefully. The same went for witnesses who testified under pseudonyms. Like Mia and Jane, their credibility was also to be assessed with special consideration. He reminded viewers the defendant had no obligation to testify, and jurors couldn't hold that against him. Another notable instruction, voluntary intoxication might negate criminal intent in some of the RICO predicates. The judge also cautioned jurors not to speculate on uncalled witnesses, like Christina Karuma, who'd been mentioned frequently but never appeared in court. As deliberations began, the judge informed jurors they'd be provided meals and could choose to continue past 5 p.m. if they wished. Sierra Gillespie, reporting live outside the courthouse, fielded a viewer question: were jurors sequestered? She confirmed they were not. They went home each night, likely reflecting on testimony and evidence as the weekend passed. Weber expressed skepticism that a verdict would arrive today. The complexity of the case, the weight of the charges et al., pointed to days of deliberation. The panel launched a poll to gauge public opinion on how long the jury might take. Brian McMonigal, a veteran criminal defense attorney, explained RICO to viewers. It was originally designed to combat organized crime, he said, requiring proof of a criminal enterprise and at least 2 predicate acts beyond a reasonable doubt. McMonigal noted this was a modern test of the statute, being used now in cases involving wealthy individuals rather than mobsters. He predicted a tough road for the prosecution. Jesse summarized the prosecution's case: that Combs had an inner circle assistants and bodyguards who enabled and cleaned up illegal activity, from organizing sexual events to intimidating victims. The defense, on the other hand, emphasized that no witness admitted to being in a conspiracy with Combs. If this was John Gotti, would the victims be calling Sammy the Bull for help? Agnafilo had asked. Mauricio Padilla then addressed a viewer question about the Mann Act transportation for prostitution. Padilla felt a conviction was likely. They've got him dead to rights, he said, citing travel records, receipts, and assistant involvement. He believed Diddy hadn't fully realized his actions were illegal, which complicated his defense. Weber agreed testimony and evidence about sex work, text messages, and credit card payments had made that charge particularly difficult for the defense to fight. Another viewer asked about Diddy's complaint regarding courtroom sketches, including a jab that he looked like a koala bear. Sierra confirmed that Diddy had seen the sketches, and that after his complaints, there was a subtle shift in their style. Image mattered to him, she said. Even amid serious charges, he had concerns about how he was depicted. Weber chimed in with a laugh, recalling the time someone animated his face onto an orange. The panel shared a moment of levity before diving into a final viewer question: would prosecutors target Christina Corum next? McMonigal doubted it. If the government was going to charge her, they likely would have done so already. Much would depend on the verdict, he said. A failed prosecution would make them cautious. Weber followed up, noting the judge's instruction that jurors should not speculate about uncalled witnesses. McMonigal said that while the instruction existed, the jury would likely focus on something else: coercion. This is a sex trafficking case involving adults, not minors, he said, and RICO involving a celebrity, not a mafia boss. Jurors would weigh whether coercion truly occurred, or whether the prosecution had simply reframed messy relationships as criminal conspiracies. Padilla added that even if jurors had already formed opinions, they'd take a few days to appear deliberate, especially in a high-profile case like this. He estimated at least a couple of days before a verdict, though perhaps before the July 4th holiday. Even the slam-dunk cases take time when the world is watching, he said. The panel agreed. This case was far from simple, and so, the waiting began. As the panel settled into the second hour of coverage, the conversation turned toward the underlying psychology of jury deliberations in high-profile trials like this one. Jesse Weber acknowledged the intensity of public scrutiny, noting that even if jurors had reached personal conclusions, they'd likely take time to project diligence. They know everyone's watching, he said. They won't rush this. Brian McMonagle echoed that sentiment. Jurors, he said, tend to feel the weight of such responsibility more deeply when the cameras are off. They know this isn't just a headline, it's a man's life. And even if they think he's guilty, they'll want to go through every piece of evidence to feel confident. Sierra Gillespie, standing outside the courthouse, reported that, although things were quiet outside now, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Reporters lingered, security remained alert, and news vans lined the block. We don't know if we're hours or days away, she said, but everyone here is treating this like it could break any second. Mauricio Padilla chimed in again, reinforcing how layered the charges were. You've got sex trafficking, forced labor, intimidation, drug distribution, it's a lot. And that's not even counting the RICO aspect. He pointed out how difficult it would be for jurors to reach agreement on each predicate act, let alone the broader enterprise charge. Weber then returned to one of the more subtle jury instructions. Judge Subramanian had emphasized that a defendant's choice not to testify must not be held against them. He remarked on how easily people unfamiliar with legal proceedings might misunderstand that, and how critical it was that jurors understood they were not to infer guilt based on silence. The panel paused on that. McMonagle noted that many defendants don't testify not because they have something to hide, but because the burden isn't on them to prove anything. It's the government's job to prove the case, not the defendant's job to explain himself. Weber then fielded a few more viewer questions, including one about how jurors would handle the testimonial contradictions. In a case like this, some stories conflicted, some accounts overlapped, while others contradicted key details. What happens when one victim says X and another says Y? A viewer asked. Padilla said it came down to credibility. The jury has to decide who they believe on. Why? Maybe they believe both. Maybe neither, but that's the job. Sierra reported that among courthouse insiders, speculation had already begun about which charges might stick. While no one knew for sure, some reporters believed the Mann Act charges transportation for prostitution were the strongest, given the volume of receipts, texts, and third-party testimony. Back in the studio, Weber circled the conversation back to Christina Courtroom. Her name had come up so often, yet she was never called to the stand. Some viewers wondered if that would become a point of confusion for jurors. McMonagle answered that it could raise questions, but Judge Subramanian had been clear jurors were not to speculate about missing witnesses. Still, he admitted, in the real world, jurors are human. They'll ask themselves, why wasn't she up there? As they neared the end of the segment, Weber looked directly into the camera and addressed viewers who were wondering why this trial mattered so much. This isn't just about a celebrity, he said. This is about power, silence, abuse, and accountability. Whatever verdict comes down, it's going to send a message, and it's going to be remembered. The panel nodded in agreement. And still, inside the sealed jury room, 12 people reviewed months of testimony, pages of instructions, and hours of video, trying to answer the question no headline could. Was it coercion, or was it choice? The clock ticked on. The discussion shifted briefly to public perception. Jesse Weber noted how polarizing the case had become, not just because of the charges, but because of who the defendant was. This isn't just any trial, he said. It's a trial about celebrity, power, and secrecy, and people feel strongly on both sides. Brian McMonagle agreed. Some people already think he's guilty because of his fame. Others think he's being targeted because of it. That's the atmosphere this jury has to cut through. Sierra Gillespie added that outside the courthouse, protesters had gathered sporadically over the last few weeks, some with signs demanding justice for the alleged victims, others questioning the integrity of the investigation. She mentioned how even passers-by had stopped to ask what was going on, many not knowing the full scope of the case. Mauricio Padilla reflected on how difficult it must be for jurors to ignore all that. They've been told not to read headlines, not to talk to anyone, but let's be honest, they live in the real world. He said, they know this is big, they know people are watching. Weber then read a question from a viewer, asking whether the civil lawsuits filed against Combs could influence the jury. McMonagle responded firmly, they shouldn't. The judge was clear, civil settlements are separate. But jurors may still wonder why someone would pay millions to someone they claim didn't tell the truth. Sierra reminded viewers that Cassie's settlement, which was reached before criminal charges were filed, was still fresh in the public memory. Though jurors were instructed to disregard it, it had been mentioned enough times during testimony that it could be hard to mentally separate. Another viewer question followed this time, about the testimony of witnesses under immunity. Mauricio explained that, while the law allows those witnesses to testify, their credibility is always a risk. If someone's testifying to save themselves, jurors are going to question what's in it for them, he said. Weber nodded and turned to the jury's task, deciding whether the RICO statute even applied in this case. This law was created to take down organized crime syndicates, he said. Can you apply it to an individual who ran a music empire? Padilla weighed in. That's what makes this case so fascinating. Diddy didn't have a crime family, he had employees, he had assistants and security. Were they part of a criminal enterprise, or were they just following orders, doing their jobs? McMonigal added that proving enterprise wasn't about titles, it was about purpose. Were these people acting to commit crimes, or were they caught in the chaos of someone else's life? He asked. That's the line the jury has to find. Sierra gave an update from outside the courthouse. Still no word from the jury room. Reporters had begun rotating shifts, coffee in hand, eyes on their phones. Some believed deliberations could stretch into the following week. Weber reminded viewers of the stakes. If convicted on the most serious charges, Combs could face decades behind bars. If acquitted, the decision would be seen as a blow to the government's use of RICO in celebrity abuse cases. As the hour closed, Weber glanced at the camera with a solemn tone. 12 people hold the answer. And until they return, we wait. The final segment began with Jesse Weber reflecting on the emotional weight jurors must be carrying. After weeks of testimony, exhibits, and arguments, they're not just deciding a verdict, he said. They're deciding whether this entire story layered in power, silence, and contradiction crossed the line into criminality. Brian McMonigal added that one of the government's biggest challenges was the lack of direct evidence tying Combs to an explicit conspiracy. You don't have someone on tape saying, let's run this enterprise, he noted. That's why the prosecution focused so heavily on pattern, repetition, and intent. Mauricio Padilla pointed out that intent was often the hardest thing to prove. You can show receipts, texts, and witness testimony, but proving someone's state of mind, that's different. That's where reasonable doubt can survive. Sierra Gillespie circled back to the jury instructions, emphasizing how detailed and technical they were. The judge didn't just say, use your judgment, she said. He laid out the legal roadmap, what counts as coercion, what makes someone part of a conspiracy, what the jury must ignore. The panel agreed that the jurors were likely poring over those instructions line by line, matching them against their notes, the evidence, and their own instincts. They speculated that some charges might create more division than others, particularly sex trafficking, which, though serious, rested heavily on interpretation and emotion. Weber shared a viewer question, could a hung jury happen? McMonigal responded, absolutely. If even one juror holds out on a single charge, you've got a deadlock. And in a case this big, with this much emotion and nuance, that's a real possibility. They discussed what a mistrial could mean. While not a legal victory for Combs, it would force the prosecution to decide whether to retry the case, a decision influenced by public pressure, witness fatigue, and the sheer expense of another high-profile proceeding. As sunset neared outside the courthouse, Sierra noted that lights were still on in the jury room. They're in there. They're working, she said, and they know what's riding on their decision. Weber closed the show by thanking the viewers for their questions and engagement. No matter what verdict comes back, if it comes tonight, tomorrow, or next week, this trial has revealed things the public rarely sees, about power, about silence, about what happens when fame and justice collide. The screen faded to images of the courtroom, empty now, but brimming with memory of testimony, argument, emotion, and still, in a locked room, just out of view. The deliberation continued. The world waited for a single word, guilty or not.